and welcome to Inspirability. Today, my guest is Mandy Hickson. She was one of the first female fast jet pilots in the Royal Air Force. She's a published author and also a motivational speaker. Mandy, welcome to Inspirability. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here. Thanks, Harriet.
Fantastic. So you were one of the first female fast jet pilots to fly the Tornado GL4.
I was.
You are now a motivational speaker, and you're a published author of An Officer, Not a Gentleman.
Gosh, it all sounds quite a lot, doesn't it? When you say it like that.
So lots of exciting stories that I'm really looking forward to finding out a bit more about today.
Yeah, great.
So first of all, tell me then, what was your main interest or main influence to get you into flying?
Well, I grew up listening to my grandpa, who was a pilot during the Second World War, and I think it just showed me really how such a huge impact somebody that you're close to or any figure that's influential can actually have on you when you're right at a stage where you're looking at different things that are there. But, you know, he had two daughters and they'd all had daughters. So I think he was looking at this entire, plethora of women in his family thinking, well, no one will be following in my footsteps. But he shared all these amazing stories of flying in South Africa and landing around anthills and all of this sort of thing. And I think they obviously rubbed off onto me. So when I was about 13 and my mum was reading the local newspaper, which spotted that the Air Cadets was opening its doors to girls, she suggested I join. She did point out that they did canoeing and I liked canoeing. And I thought, well, not as much as I liked Tom Selleck, who was in Magnum at the time, which was on a Tuesday night. And then she said, well, you go to an all-girls school and it's your only opportunity to meet some boys. And so I joined with that in mind. But I joined the Air Cadets and I flew. And that literally was a life-changing moment for myself.
Was the Air Cadets actually published at your school, or was it only in the paper that you found out about it?
It was just through the newspaper. So no, I was in state school, so you don't have a CCF or anything like that attached to a state school. So it was the Manchester Evening News. There you go.
And tell me about your journey then into the Air Force, like your scholarship, for example, your interview scholarship.
So it started really, and I remember very clearly on that very first flight, it was in a Chipmunk, which is now obviously in a museum, which just shows how old I am. But I remember saying to the pilot, excuse me, sir, do you get paid for this? And he said, yes, it's my career. And it was it's my career. And it was the first time I think I'd met somebody that was in a career and not a job, that went to work because they loved it and were passionate about what they were doing rather than because they had to earn money. And it was a realisation that you could do something as a career that you were also passionate about. And my goodness, that was going to be flying. And I really set my sights then and thought, right, I want to fly. And I was talking to him and he'd flown fast jets. And I thought, that's what I want to do. But women weren't allowed to be pilots in the Air Force at that stage. And so, as I'd chosen this impossible career, and so I just chipped away at it. Every opportunity that came my way, I took it, from promotions within the Air Cadets to joining the Ventures and Rangers, and ended up, being the leader of that and ended up being head girl. So every single opportunity I took, I thought, it's a leadership opportunity. My mum kept saying, well, if it's going to be someone, why shouldn't it be you? And when I applied for a flying scholarship, I was told I was obese, which was a little bit annoying because their height charts for women went up to 5'8" and I was 6 foot tall. So I thought maybe I could chop a limb off and that would basically take away the 3 stone in weight that they told me I had to lose. But I eventually lost the weight and I was given the flying scholarship, which at that time was 30 hours of free flying, which for anyone doing a PPL, they know that that's 3/4 of the way there. So that was a huge step for somebody. I was growing up in Manchester. We didn't have much money around and this was an opportunity of a lifetime. I'd saved up all my newspaper round money to pay for the additional 10 hours. And I gained my private pilot's license with exactly 40 hours to the dot in my logbook.
So tell me a little bit about that, being told that you were obese when you weren't, but because of the charts that they had. Tell me a bit about that story and what you had to do.
Yeah, it was really frustrating. And I think as a parent now, and I think in society where we are now, anyone hearing that would just say, well, why didn't you challenge it? But you've got to remember that this was sort of the 1980s. And we didn't tend to challenge authority. If someone, of us within a hierarchical position told us something, we tended to believe that it was true. And so none of my family challenged it. We all just thought, yes, I'm obese. And so I basically went from 12.5 stone down to just over 9 stone in weight. by going to the gym before school, eating literally a Rivita at lunchtime, and then chicken and broccoli every night after school, and going to the gym whilst playing county sport and doing every sport under the sun at school. And that was while I was doing my A-levels. And so it really, I think, shows you when I look back on that just how determined I was, how goal-focused. I had set my sights on it, and that's what I was going to do.
But the weight that you then became, was that then a healthy weight?
No, not at all. I went to be weighed into my local doctor because they said, go to your local doctor and get a certificate. I went in and she literally walked past me in the corridor and did a double take and said, oh my gosh, Mandy, what's happened to you? And I said, I was told I had to lose all this weight for the Air Force. I think she thought I was anorexic. And she said, this is absolutely ridiculous. And she went into her height charts and weight charts and she said, you should be around about 12 stone as a healthy weight for a 6 foot tall girl. And this was crazy. And I think it was, I don't know where their height charts or weight charts had come from. Perhaps it was from the Second World War, but they hadn't been updated. And so that was incredibly frustrating when I think back, that I had to go through all of that process. And she basically said, just give me the form, I'll sign it. I remember going in celebration and having an elephant's foot, which was a really huge cream cake, and I had a cream egg. And it gave me diarrhea for days because I hadn't had any sugar in my system for so long. I lost some additional weight as a consequence. But yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Did that have any long-lasting effects on you?
Yeah, of course it does. Because I think if you're ever told something at such an impressionable age that I was, 17, that's going to have an impact. And so it's going to probably always be in the back of my mind. And I've known that my weight has always been something. I found a challenge now, and I do this yo-yoing and all of these things. So it's probably not that I've ever had a healthy attitude towards weight as a consequence of that.
What would you say to anybody else in a similar situation?
Well, firstly, I would just say, fitness is so important. And I think, if we are carrying a bit of weight, well, go onto a healthy diet. And, it's more about how you feel about yourself as opposed to what a height chart is telling you or weight chart is telling you. And, as long as you're feeling good and you're healthy and it's not preventing you from doing anything, then that's the main thing.
Yeah, because also, now we do a lot more weights, and it's more about actually, I think women's body images have changed a lot.
Yes, completely.
From like when I was at school, it was looking like Keira Knightley.
Yeah.
Very slender.
Now it's Kardashians, we can have good big bottoms.
Hurrah! Whereas I think maybe the 2012 Olympics did quite a lot for that more athletic women's body image, and that actually now it's about, you say, being strong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And being healthy and the best version of you. And everybody has different body shapes.
Of course they do. And what's really lovely, I mean, we can talk about the benefits and negatives of social media, but you do see a lot of women weight training now, properly lifting some powerlifting. And it's brilliant. Maybe that's just because that's the sort of feeds that I end up looking at. So that's what I just get fed all the time. But I've got friends who, one of my really great friends, Amy, she won the UK Strongest Woman competition, and it's absolutely fantastic to see. So know that you've got a lot more women that are doing that side of fitness as well, which is brilliant.
Absolutely. I think also women past 40, it's recognised that doing weights is actually really good for the body changes.
Osteoporosis and all of those things, without a doubt. Yeah, definitely. In fact, my mum's 77 and I was just saying to her, come on, Mum, we need to be doing more weight training. She's like, oh, do I have to, darling? I was like, yes, you do, whether you like it or not. So, we never stop.
So tell me then about the next part of your journey then into the Air Force.
I got my flying scholarship. Then I went off to university in Birmingham and I joined the University Air Squadron, which I think is a really great stepping stone for anyone unsure of whether they definitely want to join the military. A lot of us joined the University Air Squadron because we wanted to fly, but we weren't certain about the military. But within weeks, it basically showed us the best side of the Air Force. And I think of the 30 of us that joined in my intake, all of us desperately tried to join as a consequence. So, it's a great selling tool for graduates to join. I gained 160 hours of flying, which is a lot more than you would get these days, because I think the focus has shifted now a little bit more on university air squadrons, where they do a lot more adventure training and things like that, whereas it was very flying focused in those days. So I finished the entire course. I got my preliminary flying badge, which was sort of, all the way through to doing formation flying, but tail chasing and everything. So, you're flying a fully aerobatic aircraft, which was the Bulldog. And in my second year at university, they changed the rules allowing women to join the Air Force, which had always been quite a big stumbling block. And I applied, and then I failed all of the tests, the aptitude tests. But you can take them twice. So I went back a year later in my final year and I resat them all and failed them all again. And I probably would have given up at that point had it not been for the boss of this University Air Squadron. And when I look back in many ways, you know, I don't think he probably ever realised just what an integral part of my entire career that he was playing, because he went the extra mile for me. He didn't look at the results of these tests and say, Mandy's failed the test and therefore Mandy is no good. He said, Mandy's failed the tests and therefore maybe the tests are no good. Why has she failed when she's actually performing as a pilot at a really high level? And so he started to look into this and found out that the majority of women were failing the tests, about 70% compared to men, where about 70% of men were passing them. Put on top of that, he got external examiners to come and assess me, and they all graded me as above average, and so which was the highest mark. And so now you've got a mismatch of a computer program saying no, humans saying yes, and the Air Force listened and then offered me a commission to become an air traffic controller, which I'll be brutally honest, it's a wonderful career for anyone that is doing it, but it was just not for me. It was not where my dream was sitting. But again, Carl Bufton said to me, Mandy, it's a foot in the door. If you take it, then you can fight from within. If you don't even take it, then you're not going to even have a space to actually argue your case. And he said, and I will not give up on this. And so I always believed that I was going to become a pilot. And I think it's really easy with hindsight and 2020 vision to say, well, of course you can say that, Mandy, because you made it. But I've got a great bit of footage, actually, of me being interviewed at Cosford Air Show when I was about 20. And I just failed all the tests to be a pilot. I'd taken the commission to become an air traffic controller. And I'm being interviewed by a guy called Gaz Top Non-Stop, which for anyone of a certain era, they might well remember him. But he was interviewing me and I was there saying, yes, I'm joining the Air Force. Yes, I'm going to be a pilot. Yes, I'm looking forward to flying fast jets. I think I was either A, quite naive, B, very blinkered, but it just showed how my mindset was, that I was so determined that that's what I was going to do. And I think those powers of visualization can be really, overwhelming, really, in how people can determine their future as a consequence of that.
So in terms of managing failure, that's a topic that we often talk about in Inspirability, and I think it can be applied in so many walks of life. For you, how did it feel when you failed the first test and then the second test, and how did you process it?
Yeah, so interestingly, I'd failed my driving test the first time, and I was furious because I thought, I'm a good driver, and I had the most immature reaction to that of, how dare I fail? But when I look back, that was the first time I'd probably actually ever failed at anything, which is not a bad stage to be at, that at the age of 17, you're failing something for the first time. But again, all of those sorts of failings that we have start to build up. And we talk about this wonderful thing of being resilient. I think resilience is a great word, but I think it's quite overused these days. And I think if we tie it together with the word purpose, then we get to see a bigger picture. And I think I was so purpose-driven that you become resilient as a consequence of that. So if we fail something but we don't really care about the outcome, you will not continue to try to achieve that goal. But if you are absolutely set on achieving something and then you fail, then you're going to constantly work out a different route to get there. And I was working, actually, I've become a trustee with the RAF Charitable Trust, and I was at a meeting the other day, and wonderful guy, Richard, said that he'd had a sergeant. And it was a lovely story because the sergeant called Sarson. And I said, why? And he said, because he was vinegar. He was so sort of toxic that he was called Sarson. And everyone was like, yeah, very bitter taste whenever they've been with him. But he had a great saying, which is, they're not stumbling blocks, they're stepping stones. And I thought, God, I really like that because, failure is such a negative word. But if we reframe that as a stumbling block and we think, okay, that's happened. I'm going to use that stumbling block and that's going to be my launch pad. That is going to be my stepping stone to the next stage. And I think, yeah, that's exactly what I did, really. Every time I failed or every time I would hit an obstacle, it's a stumbling block.
Yeah, you can always learn
stepping
something from it. And talking a bit more about the tests then. So we were talking in a slightly wider sense before about using tests to measure success and fitting in or not fitting in. So what changed with the tests? And we're talking a bit more about cognitive divergence as well.
Yeah.
We can bring that into this as well.
Without a doubt. So the tests, I think, were designed almost after the Second World War. And had been designed only really probably with men ever in mind, because there weren't female pilots. And so now we were having female pilots. What they were actually looking at with these testing, what they were finding was that they were getting a very, very different curve of the pass rate. So the men that were passing were sitting into a classic Yerkes-Dodson's bell curve, the classic, not many failed, not many passed to a really high level, and the majority just passed at a really good level in the middle. What they were finding with the women that were taking the tests is that the majority were failing them, but the ones that were passing at an incredibly high level. So a completely different distribution curve that they were seeing. And they realised that maybe they might need to look at that neurodiversity and see what they could do as a consequence of that. And it took them about 4 years to redesign the tests. They did become much longer. I'm sorry for anyone that went on to do the tests after that. But I was taken on as a test case to basically, I was told in a letter, we're going to take you on as a test case to see how far someone with no aptitude can get before they fail, which was a really horrific way of framing a question, I can tell you that. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail if you like. But what I then was asked to do once I was on the front line, I was asked to go back and redo the tests. And I thought, my God, I'm flying in Iraq by now. I'm going to go back. What happens if I fail these tests? Am I just horrific? But I passed them with flying colours. So whatever they had done, they were now seeing a more equal distribution and a similar distribution to how the men were passing as well.
So I think also in terms of within sort of society and within education, it's great now that we see education is much broader, and it's not necessarily just learning by rote and doing the same exams, that it's actually looking at someone's skills and embracing skills and finding what you're good at.
Well, yes and no. I don't think education has come on as much as it should have done.
There's more to do, isn't there?
There is a lot more to do. I worked with, it was a private school group actually linked into a charity called the Plymouth Brethren actually. And this new style of learning had come over from New Zealand and from Australia. And it's called self-determined learning. And they'd set up all of these classrooms, and you'd go into these classrooms and you might say to your class of 30, okay, today we're going to do Henry VIII. And there's all these different areas around the classroom. The introverts would tend to go, okay, I want to learn by myself. I want my laptop, I want a computer, and they would go to the desk. The extroverts might go, we could put on a play. So they do a little bit of Googling, they go into a little mini amphitheatre area, and then they would all be practising and doing this little play. You might have people that want to sit around a table and discuss it. So what we're suddenly doing is going, hold on a minute, we've got all these different learning styles. This is self-determined learning. So at the end of it, the classroom was split into two halves. They've all had the first half to do all what they want to do. The second half, they either present their information, if it's the people that have now got a document together. All of that gets loaded onto the system. And the people that are doing on the little play, that's getting filmed. And then it all goes into a file under Henry VIII. And that is what you're now going to be using as your database for learning for those children. That is phenomenal. Then sit in a row in a classroom and I'm going to tell you about Henry VIII. I mean, if you are someone that has no interest in history, you're just switching off entirely, aren't you? But if you have an interest in acting and you're now learning about Henry VIII through that medium, that is going to be embedded into your brain and you're going to remember so much more. And so I think there's a lot more that we can still do within education, actually, to embrace all of the neurodiversity that we're seeing, because we're seeing so much more of it. Both my sons are severely dyslexic. And yeah, they did not have a good experience with school at all. My husband is severely dyslexic, horrific experience at school because they didn't even know that he was dyslexic. So he was just told he was thick. And never to grace their doors again, I believe it said in his final report. So, we've got a long way we've come a long way, but there's still much more to be done.
Yes, moving on from that one-size-fits-all approach that we've had before.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you joined the Air Force then, tell me how it went.
I mean, I was delighted firstly to be into the Air Force, and then over the moon when I got the opportunity to be, actually taken on as a pilot, and that happened when I was going through officer training. Officer training was an interesting time. We were probably one of the first intakes where they had now got quite a lot of female pilots. So I think we had 4 or potentially 5, I'm trying to think. 5, air crew, because I think we had 2 female navigators and then 4 female pilots, which was great. I mean, out of 150 on the intake. So that was still great, by the way, in comparison. And so It was interesting though, because of course the Air Force was still cutting their teeth with women coming in, and especially women who were going to be pilots, because perhaps the women that had been joining up to that point were perhaps happy to be fitted into a certain box up to then. I don't know, maybe not. But I remember going through officer training and they didn't quite know what to do with a 6 foot tall, extrovert, quite strong-willed woman. I was told many times that I had to just be more feminine. I wasn't allowed to drink pints of beer. You had to order 2 half pints because that was deemed not to be feminine enough in the bar. So I always ordered 2 halves and went, sod you, I'm going to have my 2 half pints. And yeah, I found it challenging because, everyone says, oh, be the grey man. But firstly, A, I was not a man, and B, I'm a 6 foot tall person. And I think my best advice really, if I could ever give to anyone else going through it, is be unapologetically you, because I did try to mould my behaviours. I did try to fit in constantly throughout my entire service career in many ways. But actually being true to yourself is probably the biggest gift you can give yourself, because you are the very best person that you can be. And we don't need more people that just blend in. We want people who radiate and shine.
And talking then a bit about leadership. So you're told to be more feminine, and that could be very difficult, to be feminine and to be a leader and to be seen as, to be assertive enough, but not be seen as bossy. How did you balance it, and what advice can you give?
Well, I think we should talk about your own experiences as well on this one, because I do think it's a fascinating area, isn't it? And I know that this, has been obviously talked about quite often with regards to women in leadership, and that whole very fine line between what is assertive, what is aggressive. If you're being assertive, is it bossy? Well, you'd never say a man's being bossy. That's a classic word that's being used to describe women who are being assertive. And I think I've always found it a very, very fine tightrope to walk between how we behave, even how we behave around other people as well. So let's just talk about the team dynamics. If you're in a group of men and the men are swearing, that's fine. And then as soon as the woman swears, then she's told that she's being uncouth and not being feminine.
Which happened to you in the Air Force.
It happened to me in the Air Force many, many times. I mean, a classic example was going through flying training, and we'd had a dining in night, and we had this number 5 uniform, which was this really quite long skirt, and it didn't have a slit at the back, and it was basically meant you couldn't take a full step. And so I was on the dance floor, and I thought I'd just roll up my skirt a little bit, and it was still about just below my knee, but it meant I could actually dance properly. And I've got a wonderful dancing style, what can I say? We might have sworn at a few times as well. Everyone had a few drinks, and we had a great evening. The following morning, on the Monday, when we went back into work, I was called in for unofficer-like behaviour. And it was a hats on. Mandy, what would you like to say? What happened on Friday evening? And I said, nothing, sir. It was a great fun dining in night. Well, what did you do? What behaviour did you exhibit? I was like, nothing. Well, I believe that you were heard swearing. I said, well, so was every single man in the entire bar. Well, I heard that you might have rolled your skirt off. Yes, to dance with my fellow, course mates on a dance floor. Well, would you like to therefore volunteer to do orderly officer for 2 weeks as a consequence? I said, I would not like to offer that. No, sir. And he went, right, well, just get out my office. Because he didn't know what to do, because I thought, why should I? I'm not going to volunteer to take some sort of penalty, punitive action against me, because when actually I'd just been behaving in the same way. And I think that's where the Air Force didn't quite know what to do with me a little bit.
Double standards, isn't it?
Completely double standards, yeah, absolutely. And of course it's changed completely. And what I need to say is, culturally, we are in a very different place. We have to remember that I joined the Air Force 30 years ago in October. And so, we have gone through an entire cycle. Generations have changed since that, and it's not the same anymore.
So what about leadership styles then? How have you found being a female leader in a very male-dominated environment, and often having to make decisions under pressure?
Yeah, I think you develop your own sort of leadership style as well, as you will have discovered as well when you're flying. And we all adapt our style. And I think to begin with, we try different things. But also what we're seeing is we've got great role models. And when we're seeing how others behave, that's a really, really powerful tool, isn't it? So you might well have had captains when you were a first officer, captains that you've flown with that thought, I really like the way they do that. Yeah. And you will have other people that you fly with that you think,
not doing that again.
I'm not doing that. I don't like the way
No.
you've done that. And we learn as much from what is the negative as we do from the positive. And I think that's really, really important. And I've had numerous bosses that I could learn from. One, was a gentleman called Steve Hillier, who went on to be Sir Steve Hillier and head of the Air Force. And he was my boss, my first boss on the squadron. And he had a very quiet way of leading. He let things happen, but it was a very, very powerful leadership style. He wasn't the exuberant person shouting at the front at all. His communication style was very different. And then I had different bosses and different leaders at different times. And I think I therefore moulded my own style to adapt to that. But one thing I did learn was that I go back to being yourself. You can't ever in a leadership position just pretend to be someone. And I think we have to remember, especially if you're a woman in a very male-dominated world, is that you are bringing something different to the table. And that empathetic style, perhaps, of leadership that you might have is going to be really important. When I was on the squadron, it was a really tough time my first year on the squadron, actually, because I was the first female pilot they'd ever had. And I went into sort of quite an alpha male environment, to say the least. But what I noticed was over that year, I saw not just behaviours changing, but the way that they were speaking to each other was changing as well. And that the people then were coming through, we were losing a lot of the toxic side of an all-male environment. And actually people were having more honest conversations with themselves. And it was not just that a woman didn't have to fit in, but so many other men that were also pretending to be somebody they weren't. It almost gave them permission to be themselves as well. And actually we saw a much more rounded, more authentic squadron, I think, of behaviours that we were seeing.
So everyone felt that they could be themselves and be authentic, which is, a great quality of being a leader, isn't it? Just being yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Authentic. Fantastic. So when I read your book, I read about Flight Lieutenant Beige and managing that personality difference and managing conflict. So can you tell us a little bit about that story and what advice you can give?
Yeah, so if you can imagine, when you arrive at officer training, there's normally 10 to 12 of you on a flight, and you are given a flight commander. So this person, is the most important person in your world, because they are making the decisions whether or not you're going to pass that course or fail that course. They're there as well for your moral guidance, but also for your leadership training, and you spend all your time with that flight commander. And I was given, Flight Lieutenant Beige, I'll call him, very mild-mannered. He was an engineer. He was very, very quiet, and I just don't think he knew what to do with a Mandy. I tried to be quieter, but ultimately I am an extrovert. And I think if you ever do a Myers-Briggs, I sort of come as far out right as you possibly can. So, I am that sort of character, and trying to manage that I actually think for him must have been really, really hard. I mean that from a sympathetic way as well, really looking back, because, I was trying to fit in, but he was also thinking, what do I do with this woman? I don't think he'd ever really come across anyone quite like me as well. And then, he was trying to give me tips of be more feminine. I was like, but when do you want me to be more feminine? And he was telling me this while I was wearing full nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare outfit. I had a gas mask under my arm. He was like, I said, is it while I'm crawling through mud? Is it when I'm got camouflage paint on? Is it when I'm going to be trained to go to war, potentially to drop weapons? When would you like me to be more feminine?
And what do you mean by being more feminine?
And what do you mean? What does that look like? Does it mean putting on a skirt? Because I do that. And he's like, it's just everything. I was like, but I don't know what it actually translates to. And that was really hard. But, I was still 21, so I was still learning an awful lot. And also of diplomacy, let's be honest. I was probably not the most diplomatic person either. I was pretty strong-willed. And so, it was probably going to be a bit of a challenge. But I think we found a mutual place of respect by the end as well.
When you're given that feedback and you're not given that direction, it's actually very hard to know how to correct it, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And I think that's why when we look at behaviours, if we are sort of giving people feedback, and, you must see this as well within the aviation world so much, Harriet, it's that whole, we actually need to give tangible evidence of what we're talking about, and therefore what does the better side of that look like. Otherwise, it's just like be more this or do this. How does that translate?
Another thing that I read in your book that I really found very interesting to read, this is sort of with aviation safety hat on, was about making mistakes and owning up to them. So the story about your solo and the pin and the ejector seat. So would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of talks now actually around that safety sector, and I'm absolutely passionate about it. So just to put the context on that and why that was then mentioned in the story really was when I left the Air Force, I retrained in the human factors in CRM, crew resource management, and became a trainer, ran the trainer courses for different companies. And I absolutely loved it. And I found this real passion. And it made me reflect really on my own safety journey. And so when I was writing the book, I was sort of thinking about the times when perhaps I hadn't done the right thing. And the story that you were alluding to was flying the Tucano. I was going off my first solo, flying the Tucano. So for anyone that's not aware, it's the second aircraft that you'll fly after the small propeller aeroplane, which for myself was the Firefly. The Tucano was going at sort of double that speed, 240 knots. And it's got a retractable undercarriage. It's now got an ejection seat. So we're sort of going into that next stage of flying. And I was given the joyous task of flying with the chief instructor. Why would you not give the only woman on the course the chief instructor to fly with? But actually, he was a really lovely guy, Wing Commander Orwell, absolute superstar. And
Orwell?
Yes.
Steve Orwell.
He
was on my University Air Squadron.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, he was absolutely lovely chap.
Wonderful.
A true gentleman.
Yeah.
So that was not an issue. But it was this, oh my goodness, I've got this position of flying with him. Anyway, we were going to fly at Linton on news, and we'd only been doing all of our circuits at Linton. And then he said, actually, Mandy, it's really busy here today. Why don't we just go off to Dishforth? I was like, great, first solo. Now we're going to an airfield I've never flown from before. What could possibly go wrong? Anyway, on the way it was working, and it works for many different first solos, is you'll do a couple of practice circuits, you land, you travel up to the air traffic control tower, your instructor gets out, they'll go up to the top of the tower, watch you do your circuits through binoculars, then you land and pick them back up at the tower. Is that how it sort of worked for you in the past? Yeah. So things haven't changed. So anyway, I went in, we parked up in front of the air traffic control tower. He said, right, Mandy, brilliant, hop out, seats all go safe. So we took our seat pins out, we made our seats safe so that they couldn't eject while he was getting out. But now what was really interesting is, of course, I'm now in a running, the aircraft engine is still running, I'm parked outside the air traffic control tower. And normally, of course, when you would leave the line with your ground crew, the last thing that you would do as you left the line is you would take your seat pin out, you show it to your ground crew, and then you place it in the stowage area. And of course, everything was breaking up a bit.
You didn't have that trigger.
Didn't have the trigger. I'm in the middle of my checks. The engine's running. This has happened. Oh, where am I starting my checks from? Anyway, I taxied out. I flew some very nice circuits. What can I say? I was very pleased with them all. I landed, taxied in. I went, go to make my seat safe, and the seat pin was still between my legs. So if I'd had an emergency and had to eject, I would not have been able to. And I thought, okay, that was a really big mistake, but it's okay. I got away with it. And so when I do my talks, I'll say, what did I do about it? And everyone in the audience said, well, you told everyone. I said, of course you did not. Because ultimately, I was 23. We were, we didn't want to highlight ourselves. There was not this...
You're a test case.
You're a test case. The spotlight's on you. I'm flying with the chief instructor. The pressure felt enormous. But also put on top of that, the culture was not the same as the culture is now. So there was a reporting system, but the anonymity of it was pretty ridiculous, really. I mean, if I put in a report and it had the word she in it, it was pretty obvious who that was going to be. As my friend Jo Salter fell foul of when she basically managed to make her MAS live in a tornado and actually release all of her stores on the aircraft pan. And when the report went in, it was she was mentioned, and she was the only pilot. So it was like, yes, so Jo. Let's see who that was. So there was very little anonymity in that world, but also there was a lot of blame culture around. And so I got away with it. In the bar, 3 weeks later, everyone's celebrating their solo barrels. Someone said, you're never going to guess what I did on my first solo. Forgot to take my seat pin out. I said, oh my goodness, so did I. And someone else said, so did I. So out of the 12 of us, I think 3 of us had made exactly the same mistake, which suddenly means that it's not an individual issue, it's a systemic organisational problem. And therefore, actually, we needed to tell somebody, because ultimately, how were we going to feel if somebody had an incident and then they couldn't eject because they'd made the same mistake? But did we then tell anyone in the bigger structure? No, we didn't. We still didn't, because we were all still too scared. But we set up a black book, and in that black book, we all wrote down mistakes and errors that we made, and we shared it amongst all the students. So we felt that we were doing what we could. But what was really interesting was at the end of my flying career, so fast forwarding 20 years type thing, and I'm now flying air cadets with the air experience flight with 2 AEF at Boscombe Down. And I was flying with a young boy. He was my last cadet of the day. And we were taxiing out. And as we were taxiing out, I did my checks on the roll. They changed the runway direction. Suddenly it was a really long taxi out, 10 minutes as opposed to a minute. I was thinking, oh God. As I was doing my checks, which you're allowed to do on the roll, we pulled up to the holding point and I called ready for departure. I was told, stand by. I then looked down, and while I was doing my checks, I started my stopwatch early. And I don't know quite why I'd done that. I'd done it because I think it was a really long taxi, and I thought maybe I could just make this flight a little bit shorter than the 30 minutes. And it was the only instrument that the cadets recognise is the 30 minutes. And I thought, he doesn't know when I should start the stopwatch. But in my own brain, I only ever started my stopwatch when I'm cleared for takeoff. It's not written down anywhere. It's just something I did. So I looked up and I saw that my stopwatch was running. My brain told me I was clear for takeoff because I only ever start it after takeoff. I then took my feet off the brake, started to power up and head towards the hold. And as I turned to the right, which I always do to check the runway is clear, 2 jets landed right in front of me. I immediately slammed my brakes on. I had not gone over the holding line. Brilliant, haven't broken any rules. But I said to air traffic control, excuse me, can you just tell me I was cleared for takeoff? And they said negative. We said hold. And I had that moment of horror where I realised I'd made a mistake. I looked at the cadet next to me, by the way, who looked at me and went, and I thought, oh gosh, it's my mistake. And it just showed me how much the culture had changed within the aviation world and within the military in that entire period. Because when I landed, we did the flight, we landed, I was so excited to share that incident. And the reason I was excited to share it was because there was complacency, there was repetition. I'd heard clear for takeoff 10 times already. There was doing my checks on the roll, which you're allowed to do, but you don't normally do. There was starting my stopwatch when I don't normally start it until I'm clear for takeoff. So I broke my own little SAPs. But there was so much learning, and I was excited to share it because other people could learn from it. And it made me realise just how far that culture and that just culture that had seeped into the aviation world, that it was actually it was becoming the lifeblood of everything that was being done within the aviation world. And you must have seen that change as well within your time.
I think it's really, aviation's really leading the way.
Yeah.
I've got friends who are medics, and when I talk to them and I hear their stories, to me they seem really quite a long way behind.
Yeah.
Or maybe where aviation was many years ago.
Yeah.
But I think it's really exciting to see how aviation is very much the forefront of safety and safety driving change and learning lessons through other people's mistakes. Not just within aviation, but it's applied to medicine. It could be applied to any industry. Just
completely.
The more we learn from people owning up to mistakes and having this just culture where there's no apportioning of blame. Yeah. But we just look at what can we learn from it. I think it's
it's incredibly powerful. And my sister's a medical director of a hospice, and I think when that incident happened, I told her, and she said, "We're still not there in the world of medicine." Because ultimately, there is still this suing culture that could go on. There is still that sort of apportionment of blame. And she said, I would be challenged to find someone that something like that there was no negative outcome whatsoever. And I said, but these are the near misses. And it was really interesting, actually. I was working with the police force, actually. And I was doing a training session with them all around culture and error management and everything. And I loved it. So I had about 100 police officers, all senior levels from all the different forces. And I started the session by saying, who's made a brilliant mistake that they want to talk about? And then I let the silence hang in the air. Oh, it was perfect. It was like tumbleweed. I let it sit there, made them uncomfortable. So I said, okay. And then we went into the session. And we talked all around what a just culture is, you know, the fact, you know, and the definition. We talked about mistakes. I talked about for every one major event that we've got, for example, for us, it's a crash. There's been 30 minor events where there was an incident signal that went in because there was a negative outcome. But beneath your surface line, you will have 300 near misses. If we could capture these 300 near misses, how exciting are they? Because now we can be more proactive in our learning, not just reacting from the one that happens. And I said, and when we look at these 300, I went into all this detail and I was so excited about it. And I said, so now on our tables, I want you to talk about really brilliant 300 events that you've had where we can really learn from it. I couldn't shut them up.
Really?
I literally couldn't stop them. We had to extend the session because everyone was just bubbling with all of these near-miss incidents and at the end of it, I said, who has made a mistake in the workplace? And they all went, oh my goodness, they're the 300 events. And it's just how we reframe things in our mind, isn't it? I think going back to our talking about failure in the past has always had this negative connotation and we've always avoided failure. You know, let's look at why is this so inbred into us? You do a spelling test at school and you come back and you say, I got 9 out of 10 to your mum and dad or to your carers. And they said, which one did you get wrong? I got 9 A's and 1 F. What was your F in? Because ultimately we focus on that negative and we always do. I have, 2,300 5-star reviews for my book and I have 1 negative one. Which one is the negative one? I can quote it to you. Do you know what I mean? Because I focus not on the 2,300 really lovely 5-star reviews that people have spent the time to write about, but on the one that someone said, this is feminist Nazi propaganda. You know, really? Because our brains are always focused on negatives. And so we tend to have associated that with something bad that's happening. So then we get into the workplace and suddenly in aviation, we're being told, we need to talk about our mistakes. These are really great learning. Everyone goes, rubbish. There's nowhere in the world I'm telling you about making mistakes until they have proof, until they build trust. And I think when you look, and I really love that journey, when you look at the origins of reports, sorry, I'm getting into my CRM hat here. But I think it's really fascinating that if you look to begin with, while you're building trust in an organisation, and they say, to begin with, all the origins are about things, equipment, because you're testing it out. I want to say, there's never any toilet paper and it really annoys me. Does any toilet paper appear? And if it does, I go, oh, they're listening to me. They've read my report at least and they've actioned it. The next time when something happens and Harriet has messed up, I might say, well, the reason I made a mistake was because Harriet gave me a really poor handover. I want to see if you get into trouble. No trouble, because ultimately we're applying the just culture. And then finally, I hit maturity and I say, I made a mistake. And now the origin is the me. And when you hit that third level of maturity, you know that culture has actually developed so much over time. It's matured. And actually now you have real trust within your organisation and you're learning. You are now in a learning culture.
And it makes you, I think, more relatable as a leader as well. That
course.
Humility that you show.
Oh my goodness!
That ownership of mistakes and owning failure.
Yeah, I think I sat in a Red Arrows interview. One of my last trips actually flying in the Air Force at all was flying with the Red Arrows, and I thought, yeah, I've got 17 years of flying. I've got quite a lot of experience, and I went in and I watched Red One stand up right at the start, and he said, "Anyone spot the first mistake I made?" And it was just so refreshing, and there were loads of civilians standing at the back and their biggest conversation piece was, oh my goodness, the vulnerability that the leader is showing when they talk about their mistakes just sets the tone from the top. And instantly people were saying, yes, and I made this mistake. And it could have been tiny ones. It didn't really matter, but that's where your learning is going to take place. So as a leader, I think, if you can set the tone and you can show your vulnerability, that is the authenticity that people are wanting from leadership now. They are not wanting command and control, top down, do as I do, not as I say, and all of this sort of thing. They just want honesty and they want, humility in their leaders.
So one thing you touched on was your book reviews and the one negative review out of all the many thousands of positive reviews. That probably leads us quite nicely onto imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt imposter syndrome? Or
I live my life by it. Yeah.
So how do you overcome it?
Have you? I mean, I'm going to ask you, have you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah. So the question is why, and they do say a lot of women suffer from imposter syndrome, a lot more than men, but I do know a lot of men that have suffered from it as well, so it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all.
Oh no, a lot of the men on the podcast, I ask them about it, and they go, oh, that's what it's called.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. And it's this feeling of fear of being found out, fear of they're going to finally work out I have no idea what I'm talking about. When I put the book out, I don't know what I was thinking really in many ways, because you write these books, or you write a book and you think, oh, this is it. And I'd been speaking on the circuit for a long time and speaking about my story. But suddenly having a book whereby, oh my gosh, my colleagues in the Air Force are going to read it. What are they going to think about it? And I actually felt quite physically sick. And every time I get asked to speak at a military event of any way, shape or form, I hate it. I think, what on earth can I impart that they don't already know? What have I got of interest for them to hear? And I really doubt myself. And I used to get it really, really badly. The whole of my aviation career was a case of being waiting to be found out that I was not good enough. And my husband has it as well. So it's, and
for context, your husband, do you want to tell?
So my husband was in the Navy and then left the Navy and became an airline pilot. Flew for EasyJet, and I believe flew with you at some point as well, Harriet. And then ended up as a instructor, type rating instructor, examiner, and is now with the L3 as a simulator instructor. So probably, and also does a lot of competency-based training, evidence-based training, and CRM. So he's probably one of the most qualified. So
it's really refreshing to actually hear that he also has imposter syndrome.
Massive imposter syndrome, actually. In fact, it was really interesting when he was doing his TRI course. He told me that he would fail the course before he started it. And I was like, why? And he goes, well, because, that's just, I think a lot of that was the culture of the company he was doing it with at the time. And he just was waiting to be found out. And surprisingly, he did fail the type rating course because he'd had it in his head he was going to fail, and it basically he'd almost visualised that, and it then happened.
So how did he overcome it? Did he? Because obviously he's now a TRI, so
he is.
Passed it.
He found the right environment for him, actually, and the training, and he also has a very different style. So I think any pilot that I've ever met that has been trained by Craig has just said he is the best instructor they have ever had, because he is really empathetic to the nervousness that you get when you're flying, especially when you're putting a lot of money into it. If you're paying for yourself to do it, it adds another dynamic of this is costing me so much as well. And, it's really hard to separate some of those things out. But, he's so sympathetic to the nerves and to how people are feeling. And I think, he talked about setting the tone. He just puts people at ease. So he's a really, really great instructor, actually. The imposter syndrome for myself, I mean, it used to travel around then onto the stage with me as well, where I'd be thinking, oh my goodness, is this the one? And I think the biggest event I ever was absolutely overwhelmed with, I was invited to speak to the International Atomic Energy Agency out in Vienna to a operational nuclear power conference. This is me, Mandy, Mandy from Manchester, going into the United Nations buildings. What was even funnier was, if you ever work with the United Nations, they make you do all of the exams and these tests online and these training packages as if you're literally going to work with the United Nations in the most dangerous places in the world. And you're like, I have to get a room on the second floor and I have to check for bombs and I need, and I'm thinking, I'm just going to the United Nations building in Vienna. So I'd done all of these tests anyway, went in. All the flags are there. I walk into this room and it's about 200 men. It's about 3 women. There's translators all at the back. There's my little name on the podium. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And I was listening. I was the last person up to speak. And, I was hearing all of these people speaking before me. And I was thinking, oh gosh, they're all so knowledgeable. They're all so intelligent. They all know what they're talking about. I'm just literally talking about human factors in aviation and actually how that could translate across to the nuclear power sector. And actually what I realised though, there was a quick break and I went to the toilet and I thought, where's the evidence, Mandy, that you can't do this? Where's the proof that you are a failure, that what you're going to say is rubbish? And the answer was there was never any evidence. There was only ever evidence of the positive. And so I developed this strategy whereby I would only ever visualise, it's always in the toilet, by the way. Other small rooms are available, but I'd always go into a room and I'd go through all the positive ones. It could be a standing ovation. It could be a positive affirmation. And then when I open the door, and as I come out, I say, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be, for anyone that remembers Stars in Your Eyes, I'm going to be confident. And I went onto that stage and I absolutely smashed it. But what was even funnier was that I'd had a phone and I was turning the phone off, and I basically, as I was turning my phone off, a man came up and said, "Excuse me, you do remember that you need to have your phone on?" I said, "Oh, no, I don't want to have my phone on. I don't want to be disturbed." And they said, no, you need your phone on because you've got the app and anyone in the audience can only ask questions via the app. So you have to have your phone on the podium with you. And I thought, oh, this is not good. And so I turned the phone back on. I know, it was absolutely, what could possibly go wrong? So I'm standing up there, really nervous, 200 men, nuclear power sector, translators translating me, and my phone pings.
You have to check the app while doing speech.
Not while doing the speech, but it's now on there. And it was on silent, but my phone pinged up and I caught it, and it was Craig. And I took a screenshot of the message, and it said, "Oh my goodness, my wonderful wife, so proud of you. But on another aside, have you seen my work shoes? Can't find them." And I just thought, oh, how ironic. And I knew where they were. So I managed to text back whilst on the podium, no, with a kiss. But I did know where they were. They were under the bed. And I'd seen one of the dogs had actually hidden them. But there you go. What can I say?